They asked me to speak about humans. I told them no. Twice. The third time they sent a young officer named Preth to my door, and Preth had the look of someone who would stand there until the season changed, so I let him in. He sat across from me in my study, and explained that the symposium needed someone who had actually been there. Someone who had watched the conflict from close enough to smell it. Someone who had come back changed. I told him every veteran came back changed. He said yes, but most veterans were willing to talk about it. I was not willing. But I went anyway. And now I am standing in this hall, looking at 200 faces that have never seen a human in a state of war, and I am trying to decide where to begin. I will begin with what I knew before I saw anything. I knew the numbers. Every officer in the HFY fleet knew the numbers. Humans were a single-species civilization on one primary world, with a handful of colony systems. Their ships were smaller than ours. Their weapons were comparable to what the Veth had been using 3 generations ago. Their biology was soft and they required a narrow range of temperature and pressure to function. They were, by any reasonable military calculation, a manageable problem. I want you to hold that word in your mind. Manageable. I will come back to it. My name is Vethkul. I served as a fleet historian, attached to the HFY 3rd Expeditionary Command for 11 years. My job was to observe, record, and analyze. I was not a soldier. I was a witness. And it is as a witness that I tell you what I am about to tell you. The first time I understood that something was different, we were not even in direct contact with human forces. We were reviewing sensor logs from the Battle of the Cinder Shelf. It was the 3rd month of the conflict. The Cinder Shelf was a debris field surrounding a small, resource-poor moon. It had no strategic significance. Our commanders had moved through it as a transit corridor, expecting nothing. What they found was a human defensive position that should not have been there. I say it should not have been there because no rational military calculus would have placed it there. The Cinder Shelf had no value. Holding it accomplished nothing. Losing defenders there accomplished nothing except making the cost of crossing that corridor very high. The HFY 7th Transit Column entered the shelf expecting to pass through in 4 hours. They were still engaged 39 hours later. The humans defending that position were outnumbered by a ratio the analysts in our command center laughed at when they first read the report. They were operating on reduced supplies. Several of their larger ships had sustained damage before the engagement even began. By every measure we had, they should have pulled back within the first 10 hours. The corridor was not worth what they were spending to hold it. They did not pull back. I reviewed the sensor data in that briefing room, and I watched the pattern of human defensive movement, and I noticed something that the tactical officers had not flagged in their reports. The humans were not trying to hold the Cinder Shelf. They were studying us. Every position they retreated from was a position they had already extracted maximum information from. Every adjustment the HFY column made was answered within minutes, not hours. The humans were adapting in real time, and they were doing it faster than our commanders were issuing orders. One of the admirals in the room said, "They are stubborn." I looked at the data again. I said, "I do not think that is the right word." He asked what I thought the right word was. I said I did not have one yet. The column eventually pushed through. They had paid a cost that, on paper, seemed proportional. A transit corridor, some losses, mission accomplished. The debrief was calm. Someone made a joke about human persistence. People laughed. I did not laugh. I was looking at the final sensor frame before the humans disengaged, and I was looking at the formation they left behind. Not scattered, not broken. They had pulled back in order, and as they moved, they left behind a sensor ghost pattern that took our analysts 4 days to fully interpret. It was a map. The humans had spent 39 hours in an engagement they could not win, and while they were there, they had mapped everything that passed through that corridor. Every ship class, every weapon signature, every response time, every decision our commanders had made under pressure. They had not been defending the Cinder Shelf. They had been reading us. The admiral who had called them stubborn received my written analysis 3 days later. He sent back a note with 2 words on it: "Keep watching." I kept watching. There was a young officer in that briefing room, a general named Sova. He had come to the symposium today. He is sitting in the 3rd row, and he has not smiled since I started speaking. He was in that briefing room 11 years ago, and he heard the same joke everyone else heard. I watched him laugh. He is not laughing now. That is how most of these stories begin. Someone laughing, and then, a little later, someone not laughing anymore. The second thing I want to tell you happened 4 months after the Cinder Shelf. By that point, our command had engaged human forces in 9 separate theaters. We were winning most of them, in the sense that we held more territory at the end of each engagement than we had at the beginning. The numbers looked good. The projections looked good. I remember sitting in the operations center and watching the projections, and feeling something I could not name. A kind of wrongness, like looking at a very clean report, and knowing the person who wrote it had left something out. I pulled the casualty ratios for every engagement, ours versus theirs. The numbers were not what they should have been. We were winning. But each time we won, we were spending more than the last time. Not dramatically. Not enough to cause alarm. Just a small increment, each engagement, trending in a direction that no one had drawn a line through yet, because each individual data point looked acceptable. I drew the line. I brought the chart to my commanding officer, a senior historian named Vel Takari, and I put it on the table between us without saying anything. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, "Have you shown this to Fleet Command?" I said I had not. I said I wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly first. She looked at the chart again. She said, "You are reading it correctly." She said it very quietly. I took the chart to Fleet Command the next morning. The admiral who received it studied it for less than a minute, then told me that individual trend analysis over 9 engagements was statistically premature, and that I should continue my observation duties and submit my findings in the standard quarterly report. I submitted my findings in the standard quarterly report. 6 months later, the trend was no longer subtle. By then, everyone could see the line I had drawn. By then, it was too late to pretend the line did not matter. That is the end of what I need to tell you about the beginning. I want to take a short pause here because some of you look like you want to ask questions, and I can tell from the way General Sova is gripping the arm of his chair that he is trying to decide whether to say something. I will save everyone the trouble. Yes, we underestimated them. Yes, the early analysis was wrong. Yes, the people who dismissed the warning signs had reasons that seemed rational at the time. They always do. That is not the interesting part of this story. The interesting part is what the humans were doing while we were busy underestimating them. That is what the next part of this evening is about. So I ask you to stay in your seats, and to perhaps set down whatever you are drinking, because the story I am about to tell you involves a concept that does not have a clean translation in any language I am aware of. The humans call it a war game, and when I first heard it explained, I laughed. I want you to remember that I laughed. I had been laughing at the wrong things for a long time, before I understood what was in front of me. The war game. I learned about it in the 7th month of the conflict, when a Keth Sorai intelligence unit captured a human logistics depot near the edge of the Reach. It was a small depot. Nothing remarkable about it except the documents inside. The documents were simulations, hundreds of them. Models of battles that had not happened yet. Models of battles the humans expected to lose. Models of every failure they could imagine, run again and again, until someone had found a way to survive each one. They were studying their own worst days before those days arrived. The intelligence officer who briefed us called it contingency planning. He said all advanced militaries did it to some degree. I asked him to show me the depth of what the humans had done. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They simulated us better than we simulated ourselves. Let me tell you about the strangling of the Reach." By the 7th month, the Keth Sorai 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had pushed deep into what should have been a favorable position. We held the forward stations. We had established supply lines through 12 transit corridors. Our admirals were pleased. I was not pleased. I had been reading human movement patterns for 7 months, and I had begun to recognize something in the way they pulled back. They did not pull back the way a defeated force pulls back. They pulled back the way a tide pulls back. You know what happens after a tide pulls back? The humans did not try to match us in direct fleet engagement. They had done the math, and they knew they could not win that fight. Not yet. And so they did not take it. Instead, 47 separate operations began within a single standard week, spread across 12 transit corridors and 3 supply staging areas. Small ships, fast ships, crews of 8, 10, 12. They hit supply convoys. They disrupted fuel transfer stations. They did not try to destroy anything permanently. They just made every single supply run cost more time than it should have. A half-day delay here, a rerouted convoy there, a fuel station offline for maintenance because of a very precise and very inconvenient technical fault. Our admirals were not worried. They called it harassment. I went back to the depot documents we had captured. I looked at the simulations the humans had run. One of the simulations was called, in their language, something that translates loosely as the patient hand. I read it 3 times. It was us. They had built a model of the HFY logistical system, identified every point where a small delay would compound into a larger delay, mapped the cascade, and then planned 47 simultaneous operations that would trigger that cascade over a period of several months. They had not planned to defeat us in battle. They had planned to make us unable to fight. I brought this analysis to Fleet Command. I was told that the forward supply situation was adequate, and that the human harassment operations were being handled. I was told this by an admiral who had just received a logistics report showing fuel reserves in 3 forward stations at 60% of standard. 2 months later, those same stations were at 22%. There was a morning I will not forget. I was in the operations center when the report came in from Admiral Govan, commanding the forward fleet. He was requesting an emergency fuel transfer. He had planned an offensive operation for that week, and the fuel was not there to execute it. The room went quiet, in a way that rooms go quiet when everyone understands something at the same moment. Our offensive was not cancelled. It was simply postponed while we resolved the supply situation. The humans gave us 4 days to begin resolving it. On the 5th day, they hit 3 of our rear supply convoys at the same time. I want to explain something about what I saw in the weeks that followed, because I think it is the most important thing I can tell you about how humans fight. Our commanders began making decisions under pressure, and when HFY commanders make decisions under pressure, there is a pattern. We prioritize the most recent threat. We respond to what is in front of us. It is not a flaw, exactly. It is a habit. We are very good at managing immediate problems. The humans had planned for that habit. Every action they took in that period was designed to produce a specific reaction from us. They would strike a convoy. We would redirect escort ships to protect convoys, which meant fewer ships watching the transit corridors, which allowed smaller human vessels to move resupply to their own forward positions, which meant their forces in areas we thought we had pressured were actually being quietly reinforced. I started keeping a separate log. I tracked every human action and the HFY response it produced, and after 6 weeks I could see the shape of it. Not chaos, not a series of separate decisions. One plan. A single plan running across 47 simultaneous threads, and we had been executing it for them by responding exactly the way they had expected us to respond. A junior analyst named Corvin was working alongside me during that period. He was 20 years old, and he had never seen a conflict before this one. He sat next to me one evening looking at my log and he said, very quietly, "They wrote the orders we were going to give before we gave them." I told him that was not quite right. He asked what was right. I said, "They did not write our orders. They wrote the conditions that would cause us to write our orders. There is a difference." He thought about that. Then he said, "That is worse." I told him yes. It was considerably worse. At this point in the symposium, someone in the back row laughed. A short, uncomfortable sound. I looked in that direction. The laughter stopped. I did not say anything about it. I simply continued. "There is a human officer I want to tell you about. I never met her in person. I only know her through the reports and the testimony of people who encountered her. Her name was Ellen Marsh, and she commanded a logistics coordination unit during the strangling of the Reach. She was not a combat commander. She was an administrator. Her job was to move supplies, plan routes, and make sure the right materials were in the right places at the right times. In the HFY system, logistics officers are not considered prestigious. They are important. We know they are important, but they are not the officers whose names get recorded in the histories. The admirals get the names. The fleet commanders. The people who give the orders in battle. Ellen Marsh was running 47 operations simultaneously. From a station the size of a medium transport ship, she had a staff of 31 people. She was sleeping, by all accounts, approximately 4 hours a night. When one of our escort sweeps found her station and destroyed it, The 47 operations did not stop. They continued without interruption for another 11 days before our analysts figured out what had happened. She had distributed every piece of the plan to every unit before the station was hit. Not because she had predicted the attack on her specific station, because she had run a war game that predicted an attack on a station like hers, and she had built the plan so that no single point of failure could stop it. We found her secondary command post 8 weeks later. It was on a converted mining vessel. She had set it up the day after her first station was destroyed. I asked the intelligence officer who found the secondary post what condition it was in. He said it looked like it had been operating continuously, like she had simply moved and kept working. He said there was a photograph on her desk, a child in a garden. He said she had clearly taken it with her when she evacuated. I do not know why that detail stayed with me, perhaps because it made her real in a way the reports had not. She was not a concept. She was a person who moved from one burning building to the next, and she kept her daughter's photograph because she intended to go home to that pet daughter when this was over. She did go home. I checked. She survived the war. I hope the garden was still there. Now I want to tell you what happened to the HFY forward fleet when the fuel situation became critical. We did not have the reserves to execute our planned offensive. Our admirals debated. Some argued for a modified operation. Some argued for pulling back to consolidate supply lines. The debate lasted 11 days. In those 11 days, the humans did not attack us directly. They waited. Our intelligence units reported this as a positive sign. Human forces are not pressing their advantage. It was in 3 separate briefings. 3 times, someone looked at the fact that the humans were not attacking us and concluded it meant they were not ready to attack us. I submitted a note suggesting an alternative explanation. The note said, or, they are letting us run out of time. The note was filed 17 days after the supply crisis became critical. The HFY forward fleet received orders to begin a staged withdrawal to more defensible supply positions. It was the first time in the conflict that we had moved backward. The humans did not pursue aggressively. They did not need to. They had already achieved what they wanted. We were in positions we had chosen for ourselves, but those positions had been shaped by every action the humans had taken over the previous 4 months. We were where they had arranged for us to be. I remember standing in the operations center as the withdrawal orders went out, and feeling something that I had felt once before, a long time ago. When I was studying ancient game theory in my academic training, the feeling of watching someone lose a game and only understanding the losing move in the last moment, when all the earlier moves had seemed perfectly reasonable. General Sova is looking at me. He was in the operations center that day. He knows this part of the story. He has never, to my knowledge, spoken about it publicly. I am speaking about it now because the people in this room need to understand that the supply crisis was not bad luck. It was not a failure of individual commanders. It was the intended outcome of a plan that had been designed and executed by a logistics officer, working from a converted mining vessel, who kept her daughter's photograph on her desk, and who had already modeled every way her plan might fail before she began. That is what humans do. That is what they were doing while we were busy feeling confident about the numbers. I want to pause here. I am going to drink some water, and then I am going to tell you about a garrison that held for 19 months, and a concept that does not translate into any language I have ever studied. They call it, in English, the word that means not giving up when giving up is the only sensible thing to do. I am going to need a few seconds to find the right way to say this, because the word they use is simple, and the thing it describes is not simple at all. It is the thing that scared me more than any weapon I ever saw, more than the fleet engagements, more than the supply collapse, more than any of it. Stay with me. The garrison at Heron Station had been cut off for 11 days before anyone on our side confirmed it was intentional. The initial assessment was a communication disruption, then a navigation hazard, then a temporary blockade pending strategic review. There were 3 separate internal memos from 3 separate departments, each explaining the isolation of Heron Station in terms that sounded temporary. I read all 3 memos. I also read the operational order that had caused the isolation. The order was not temporary. It was designed to last. The HFY command had decided that cutting off Heron Station and waiting for its garrison to surrender was more efficient than a direct assault. The garrison was not large. The station had limited supplies. The math was simple. The garrison would run low on essentials. The humans inside would assess the situation. They would recognize that resistance was no longer viable. They would request terms. We would wait. They would ask. We would answer. The matter would be resolved with minimal cost. That was the plan. The garrison held for 19 months. I am going to say that again, because the first time I read it in the report, I read it twice myself. 19 months. A garrison with limited supplies, cut off from resupply, surrounded, with no reasonable expectation of relief, held for 19 months. Our analysts ran 3 separate assessments in that period. Each one concluded that the garrison's capacity to continue resistance had reached its limit. Each one was wrong. In the 9th month, our command sent a communication offering generous surrender terms. Food, medical treatment, safe return. The offer was, by all accounts, legitimate and fair. The garrison commander, a man named Owen Price, sent back a reply that was 4 sentences long. I memorized it. He said the garrison had received the offer. He said the garrison had discussed it. He said the garrison had voted. He said the vote was unanimous, and that they would let us know if that changed. That was all. I showed the reply to my senior officer at the time, a woman named Vel Takari who had been with the Expeditionary Command since the beginning. She read it twice. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "They voted." I said yes. She said, "Under those conditions, they held a vote." I said yes. She put the paper down. She did not say anything else for a while. I understood what was strange about it. In the Keth Sarai military structure, decisions under extreme conditions come from command authority. A commander assesses, decides, and the unit follows. It is efficient. It is logical. When resources are critically low and survival is uncertain, a single point of decision-making is faster and clearer than consultation. The humans had called a meeting, not because Owen Price lacked authority. He had full command authority over that garrison. He could have replied on his own. He chose to ask every person under his command what they wanted to do, and then he did what they decided. I spent a long time thinking about why. It was not until much later that I understood it. When you ask people what they want to do, and they choose to keep fighting, they own that choice. It is not something imposed on them. It is not an order they are following because they must. It is a decision they made for themselves. And a person who has chosen to do something, who has claimed ownership of that choice, is a fundamentally different force than a person who has been told to do it. Owen Price did not need his garrison to follow his orders. He needed his garrison to want what he wanted. There is a difference. It took me 11 months of observing humans before I understood what that difference meant in practical terms. In the 12th month, our command reduced the offer. The terms were no longer as generous. The logic was that continued resistance would eventually break under increasing pressure, and a garrison that had held out 12 months would understand that the offer was now lower because it had earned less consideration. Owen Price did not reply for 6 days. When he replied, he said the garrison appreciated the update. That was all. In the 14th month, the garrison began producing food from internal hydroponic systems that our analysts had assessed as decorative when they had last reviewed the station's schematics. The analysts had not looked closely enough. The systems were not decorative. They had been quietly expanded over several months using materials the garrison had listed in maintenance requisitions. The garrison was not running out of food. It had been preparing not to run out of food since approximately the 3rd month of the isolation. I want you to think about that for a moment. In the 3rd month, with 11 or 12 months of isolation still ahead of them, people with limited resources and no certainty of relief were already planting crops, not because they knew they would hold for 19 months, because they intended to. There is a woman I want to tell you about. Her name was Carol Yates. She was not the garrison commander. She was a maintenance technician. She was 26 years old. She was the one who had converted the hydroponic systems. She was also the person our intelligence unit captured in the 16th month during a very brief and very controlled engagement near the outer docking ring. She was brought to an intelligence processing facility. She was not treated poorly. I want to be clear about that because it is relevant to what happened next. She was given food, medical attention for a minor injury, and appropriate accommodation. She answered every question she was asked. She was cooperative, calm, and very specific in her answers. She told us about the garrison's supply situation, the condition of their equipment, the morale of the personnel. She answered technical questions about the hydroponic systems she had built. She described the station layout in detail that matched our existing schematics, and corrected 3 points where our schematics were wrong. Our intelligence officers were very pleased with her cooperation. What they did not realize, for approximately 3 weeks, was that Carol Yates was asking just as many questions as she was answering. Not directly, not in ways that triggered any of our standard protocols for identifying intelligence collection behavior. She asked about the food they served her. She asked about the facility's environmental systems. She made small observations about the other personnel she saw during brief transfers. She asked a guard, in a tone of idle curiosity, whether the shift schedules rotated weekly or monthly. She was answering our questions. She was also mapping the facility. In the 18th month of the garrison's isolation, a relief force reached Heron Station. They came in from an angle our defensive positioning did not cover, using information about the Keth Sarai patrol patterns around the station that our analysts determined had been passed through a communication channel we had not identified. We determined later that the channel was Carol Yates. She had spent 2 months in our intelligence facility being cooperative, courteous, and very, very observant. When the relief force needed to know where the gaps in our patrol coverage were, she already knew. She had been building that knowledge from the day she arrived. The relief reached Heron Station. Owen Price acknowledged the relief, submitted a status report, and then held another meeting. He asked his garrison what they needed, not what they had endured, not what they deserved, what they needed, present tense, moving forward. I read that report 4 times. I am not a soldier. I have never been a soldier, but I have spent my life studying how groups of beings behave under extreme conditions, and I want to tell you that what happened at Heron Station does not match any pattern I had been trained to analyze. Every model of prolonged resistance I had ever studied included a degradation curve, extended isolation, limited resources, and sustained pressure, produce a predictable pattern of behavioral change in any group. Resolution gives way to uncertainty. Uncertainty gives way to fear. Fear eventually affects decision-making. The garrison at Heron showed none of those patterns. Their decision-making in the 19th month was, by all measurable indicators, as clear as it had been in the first month. I asked a captured human officer to explain this to me. Later, after the conflict had ended, I asked him how a group of beings maintained that kind of cohesion under conditions that should have broken it. He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "When people choose to stay, they don't spend energy deciding whether to leave. They already decided. So all the energy goes somewhere else." I asked him where it goes. He said, "Into the problem in front of them." He said it like it was obvious. It is obvious, I think, if you are human. It is not obvious if you are not. General Sova is very still right now. I am aware that several people in this room have stopped writing notes. I take that as an indication that what I am saying is reaching them, which is the purpose of being here. I have one more story from this period before I move to the final phase of the conflict. It is a short one, but I think it is the most important small detail I can give you. In the 17th month of the Heron isolation, our analysts reviewed the garrison's outgoing communication logs from before the cutoff. Standard procedure, looking for anything that might have warned them, anything they might have prepared. They found nothing unusual, but one of the junior analysts noticed something. In the weeks before the cutoff began, Owen Price had filed 8 routine maintenance requests. All approved, all minor. Parts for environmental systems, replacement filters, calibration equipment. The analyst cross-referenced those requests against what the garrison had actually used during the 19 months. 6 of the 8 requests were for materials that had been quietly repurposed into the hydroponic expansion. Owen Price had filed routine maintenance paperwork to build his garrison's food supply. Before the blockade started, he had seen it coming. Not specifically, not the date, not the exact shape of it, but he had understood, at some point before it happened, that his station was the kind of station that might get isolated, and he had spent the weeks before it happened making quiet preparations. The analyst who found this sat in my office for a long time looking at the report. She was young. She had joined the Expeditionary Command 6 months into the conflict. She had grown up hearing that humans were a manageable problem. He made it so there was no moment where they had to decide if it was worth continuing. They always had enough to continue. I said yes, she said. That was on purpose. I said yes. She looked at me. How do you fight someone who does that? I did not answer her. Not because I did not have thoughts on the matter, but because I was not sure the answer was the kind of thing she needed to hear at that moment. I will answer it now. For this room. Because I think you are ready to hear it. You do not fight someone like that. You talk to them. And that brings me to the part of this story that I have told the fewest people, because it is the part that is the hardest to explain, and because it is the part where I have to admit something that took me a long time to admit. When the war ended, I was not relieved. I was unsettled. Let me tell you why. The war did not end with a final great engagement. I think many of you, from the histories you have read, imagine a moment of decisive battle, followed by the laying down of arms. That is how we record conflicts in our tradition. The turning point, the final action, the terms. The end of the human conflict was not like that. It was a process. By the 17th month of the total conflict, the HFY command had reached a position it did not like to name out loud. We were not defeated in the sense that our forces were broken, or our territory had been taken. We still held significant positions. Our fleet was diminished but intact. Our command structure was functioning, but we could not advance. Every time our admirals planned an offensive operation, the resource calculation came back wrong. The cost of the next move was always higher than the expected gain. The humans had done something to the geometry of the conflict. They had made progress expensive in a way it had not been at the beginning, and they had done it so gradually and so carefully that there was no single moment where we could point and say, "This is where it changed." It had changed everywhere, all at once, over months. I was in the room when the senior command discussed the option of negotiation. I was there as an observer, as I always was. I did not speak unless asked. Admiral Dorvac, who commanded the entire expeditionary force, said a thing I will repeat exactly, because I wrote it down as he said it. He said, "We are not losing, but we are not going to win. And the longer we continue, the less we will have when this is over." That was the military assessment, not a defeat, a calculation. The humans were willing to negotiate. We learned this through a third-party channel, a neutral diplomatic service that both sides had used for non-combat communication throughout the conflict. The humans had indicated, through that channel, that they believed a negotiated resolution was possible, and that they were prepared to discuss terms. Our analysts spent 2 weeks preparing for the worst. Punitive reparations, loss of territory, restrictions on fleet development. These were the terms that made sense, from a strategic standpoint, for a side that had successfully reversed a larger force's advance and pushed it into an unwinnable position. The summit was held on a neutral station. I attended as part of the historical observer delegation. I was not in the negotiating room, but I had access to the records. The human delegation was led by a senior diplomat named Charles Quinn. I want to describe him because I think the description matters. He was older. He had a quiet manner. He did not speak quickly or dramatically. He brought a small staff and very organized notes. He began the first session by stating, clearly and without ceremony, that the human government wished to resolve the conflict and that it had prepared a draft framework for discussion. The HFY delegation received the framework. They read it. Then several of them read it again. The framework was not punitive. It addressed territorial boundaries in terms that reflected the pre-conflict status with minor adjustments. It addressed compensation for specific categories of loss. It included a mechanism for future disputes that did not involve direct conflict. It was structured for stability, for a future where both sides could function, and neither side would be nursing a wound that would eventually reopen. One of our senior diplomats, a woman named Tevith, asked Charles Quinn directly why the framework was designed this way. He said, "Because we know what it costs to rebuild. We have done it enough times to know that what we take in a settlement we spend twice over in the generation that comes after." Tevath looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You had the leverage to demand more." He said, "Yes," she said. "You chose not to," he said. "We chose not to." That was the whole conversation. 4 sentences. But I have written it out in full because I think the 4 sentences contain something important. He did not say they were being generous. He did not frame it as mercy or restraint or moral superiority. He said they had done the math on what punitive settlements cost in the long run, and the math said this framework was better. They were not being kind. They were being efficient. I have thought about the difference between those two things for a very long time. After the first day of talks, I was standing on an observation deck looking out at the station's exterior lights. A human officer came and stood near me. Not one of the diplomats. She was part of the security delegation. Her name was Laura Finch, and she had, I learned later, served in 2 of the major engagements during the conflict. She did not speak about the war. She talked about her daughter, who was learning a musical instrument. She talked about her garden, which she had apparently let become somewhat wild during the conflict, and was looking forward to reclaiming. She talked about a type of bread that was specific to her home region, that she had not eaten in 2 years. I listened. I did not say very much. I was watching her while she spoke. She was not performing normalcy. She was not making conversation to fill silence, or to put me at ease, or to demonstrate something. She was simply talking about the things she was looking forward to, because those things were real to her, and the conversation was an appropriate place to mention them. The war was not what she was talking about. The war, for her, was behind her. It was a thing she had done that was now over, and she had set it aside the way you set aside a task you have finished, and she was already oriented toward the next part of her life. I stood on that observation deck and felt something that I did not fully understand until much later. I had spent nearly 2 years studying humans in conflict. I had watched them plan, adapt, endure, and innovate. I had watched them do things that no model in my training had predicted. I had developed a considerable and specific respect for what they were capable of when pushed. And standing next to Laura Finch while she talked about bread, I understood something that the conflict itself had not quite made clear. The war had been an interruption, not for every human perhaps, not in a simple sense, but in the sense that mattered most. The war had been a problem they had handled. They had oriented toward it with everything they had, solved it to the extent it could be solved, and were now reorienting toward the things that were actually central to their lives. Their daughter, their garden, their bread. They had fought a war with such totality of focus and such efficiency of effort that they had come out the other side still knowing exactly who they were and what they wanted. I had been observing them for 2 years, and I had not seen that coming. The settlement was signed 4 days later. It was implemented without significant dispute. The mechanisms it established have functioned, as of this evening, for 11 years. I left the summit on a transport heading back to Keth Sarai space, and I sat in my cabin and wrote for a long time. Not a report, not an analysis. I wrote what I had seen, and what I thought it meant, and what I still did not understand. I filled 43 pages. I still have them. They are not published. They may never be. But I read them occasionally, when someone asks me to speak at a symposium about humans, and I want to remind myself of the specific texture of the confusion I felt on that transport. Because confusion is the honest word. I had watched them fight. I had watched them endure. I had watched them negotiate with clarity and restraint. I had watched Laura Finch talk about bread, and I still was not sure I understood them. I am still not sure I understand them. That uncertainty is, I think, the most accurate thing I can tell you. I want to be honest with you about something before I close. When I agreed to come here tonight, I thought I was going to tell you a set of interesting military stories. I have told interesting military stories before. They tend to have a comfortable shape. A problem, an escalation, a resolution. Lessons that can be written down and applied. I do not think what I have told you tonight fits that shape. What I have told you is closer to a series of moments where I was wrong, or where the people around me were wrong, or where an entire analytical framework turned out to be insufficient. And I have told you those moments not to suggest that we were foolish or careless, because we were neither. We were experienced, careful, and working with the best information we had. We were simply not prepared for the specific thing in front of us. The question this room wants answered, I suspect, is some version of how do we prepare for humans? What do we do with this information? How do we adjust our models, our strategies, our understanding of risk? I am going to give you an answer, but it is not the answer most of you are hoping for. The answer is not a military adjustment. The answer is a perceptual one. You need to stop thinking about humans as a problem to be managed. I know that framing is comfortable. I know it is how we are trained to think about security concerns, especially smaller ones, especially ones that seemed, at the beginning, to fit a manageable profile. But the thing I watched happen over 2 years is that humans do not behave like a problem to be managed. They behave like a civilization that has already survived itself. They have been through things, internally, in their own history, that would have ended most species. They have fought wars among themselves that destroyed entire regions of their own world. They have made catastrophic errors and rebuilt from them. They have developed and discarded ideologies, economic systems, governing structures, at a pace and scale that is genuinely unusual. And they came out of all of it intact. Scarred, certainly, changed, but with their fundamental character unbroken. When you have survived that kind of internal history, an external conflict is a problem you have category experience with. Not the specific details, but the shape of it. The requirement to hold together under pressure, to adapt faster than the pressure changes, to keep going when going is the only option. They have practiced that. On themselves. For centuries. Carol Yates mapping an intelligence facility while answering questions cooperatively. Ellen Marsh setting up a secondary command post the day after her first one was gone. Owen Price filing maintenance requests for crops before the blockade started. Laura Finch talking about bread the day after the peace was signed. These are not exceptional humans. I want to be very clear about that, because I have heard people say, after hearing stories like these, that humans simply have exceptional individuals who perform in extreme circumstances. They do have exceptional individuals. Every civilization does. But Carol Yates was a maintenance technician. Ellen Marsh was a logistics officer. Owen Price was a garrison commander of a station that no one had considered strategically significant. Laura Finch was a security escort at a peace summit. They were, by every measure, ordinary. The things they did were not ordinary. And the gap between those two statements is the thing I want to leave you with tonight. Because if exceptional actions were performed only by exceptional people, you could account for them. You could identify the exceptional people and factor them in. But when ordinary people perform in ways that your models classify as exceptional, your models are wrong. Not wrong in a specific place that can be corrected. Wrong in the underlying assumption. The underlying assumption that brought us into that conflict was that humans were a manageable problem, because the numbers said so. The numbers were not measuring the right things. General Sova, I know you are still in this room. I know you remember the operations center when the withdrawal orders went out. I know you remember what it felt like to look at a map that you had believed was in your favor, and understand, in a single moment, that it had not been in your favor for a very long time. I am not telling this room that story to embarrass you. I am telling it because you understand something that the people who were not there do not understand. You understand that the realization did not come with a loud noise. It came quietly. It came as a result of reading a report, and doing a calculation, and looking at a line on a chart that had been trending in a direction that seemed small until it did not seem small anymore. It is always quiet when it changes. That is the thing that did not make it into the official histories. The official histories describe battles, engagements, turning points with dates attached to them. They are accurate in their details and they are wrong in their impression, because they make the conflict look like a series of decisive moments when what it actually was, from the inside, was a slow and continuous process of understanding, arriving too late. I do not tell these stories to frighten you. I understand that is how some of you are receiving them, and that is natural. Fear is a reasonable initial response, but fear is not what I am asking you to carry out of this room. What I am asking you to carry out is something closer to precision, a precise understanding of what you are dealing with. Not an inflated understanding, not a mythologized one. The humans themselves would be the first to tell you they are not invincible, that they make errors, that they have limits. They do have limits. I have seen those limits. They get tired, they get frightened, they make bad decisions under certain conditions. They are not a species without weakness, but their response to their own weaknesses is the part that matters. When they get tired, they build systems that function while they sleep. When they get frightened, they hold votes about what to do with the fear. When they make bad decisions, they run simulations of the bad decision afterward and build the lesson into the next plan. They do not hide from their own failures. They study them. That is not invincibility. That is something more practical and more durable than invincibility. That is competence as a habit. I have one last thing to say, and then I will thank you for your time and sit down. On the transport home from the Peace Summit, I shared a meal with a human named Patrick Grove. He was a junior member of the diplomatic staff. Young, not yet 30. He had been included on the delegation as a note-taker and had spent most of the summit sitting quietly and writing things down. I asked him what he thought about the settlement. He said he thought it was a good outcome, considering everything. I asked him what he thought considering everything meant. He thought about it. He said, "We came in, we did what we had to do, and we came out with something stable. That's the best you can hope for." I asked him what he was going to do when he returned home. He said he was going to visit his father, who had a farm in a northern region. He said he had promised his father he would come home and help with a particular seasonal task that he had missed the previous 2 years. He described the task. It was not interesting. It was exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary thing that exists in every civilization. He was looking forward to it. I thought about that for a long time on the rest of the trip. I thought about it in the weeks after. I think about it still. A young man who had spent 2 years in the middle of an interstellar conflict was going home to help his father with a farm task. Not because the war had left him empty and he was retreating to something simple. Because that farm task was part of a life that had been waiting for him, and now he was going back to it. The war had interrupted his life, and he was going back to his life. I realized, sitting in that transport, that this was perhaps the most specific thing I could say about humans that no report or analysis had ever quite captured. They have lives that wars interrupt. Most civilizations I have studied develop at various points, cultures in which conflict becomes central. It shapes identity. It shapes self-understanding. A people that has fought many wars often comes to organize itself around that fact. The war becomes part of who they are. Humans have fought more wars than any civilization I have encountered. By a significant measure, their history is dense with conflict in a way that is genuinely startling when you sit down and read it. And yet, Patrick Grove was going home to help his father with a farm task. Laura Finch was going home to her garden. Carol Yates, if I had been able to ask her, would probably have told me something similar. The wars had not become who they were. The wars were things they had done. The farm and the garden and whatever Carol Yates went home to. Those were who they were. I am not sure any other species I have encountered has managed to fight as much as humans have fought, and remain that clearly themselves on the other side of it. I do not know if that is a strength. I think it might be the most important strength, because a being who knows exactly who they are, when the pressure is at its highest, is a being you cannot break by applying pressure. You can hurt them. You can cost them. But you cannot reach in and take the thing they are protecting, because the thing they are protecting is not a territory or a resource. It is themselves. I said at the beginning of this evening that I wanted to explain the word manageable. I told you I would come back to it. This is me coming back to it. Humans are not a manageable problem. That framing will lead you to the same place it led the Keth Sarai III Expeditionary Command. It will lead you to look at the numbers, feel confident about the numbers, and fail to measure the things the numbers do not capture. Humans are a peer civilization. Managing a peer is not possible. Relating to a peer is. What that means, in practical terms, is not something I can tell you in a single evening. It is a longer conversation. It is, I suspect, a conversation that will take generations to have properly, but it begins here, with understanding what you are actually dealing with. Not a stubborn species, not a lucky one, not a surprisingly resilient one. A species that has survived everything it has ever faced, including itself, and come out the other side still knowing what a garden is for. I hope you will think carefully about what to do with that. Thank you for listening.